up, let's talk about what's called parameters and arguments. So obviously, we've hard coded here the amount of the bill, and we've hard coded the amount of the tax rate. That's not a very I don't know. We always like talk in JavaScript when we say like don't repeat yourself, keep your code dry. And if you're making like a function called calculate bill and you're assuming that the bill is $100 and the tax rate is 13%, that's not good unless we call it calculate bill for bill that was 100. You get the point, right? That's too specific. So what we want to do is we want to turn these things into variables. So what we could do here is maybe we'll go up here and we'll say like let bill is equal to 100 and let tax rate is equal to 0.13. And then what we'll do in here is we just replace that with bill, and we replace this with 1 plus tax rate. And that will probably work. But you could probably tell by the sound of my voice, that's not the best way to do it. And I'll tell you why. So the reason we don't do this is because this function right here, calculate bill, is relying on what is called global variables. Now, we're going to go much more into scope and global variables and scoping variables to a function and these things called closures, which is kind of a nifty way to use variables. But for right now, what we need to know is that this is a function that needs some data. And when the function is not passed in data, it does this thing called reaching outside of the function in order to look up that data in a higher scope. Again, we'll go into scope more in a future video. So what we need to know right now is it's not great to reach outside of a function in order to get your data. Now, if we wanted to do like, let's get rid of this console log here. Let's get rid of that. And let's just make a my total 2 and run it. And then we'll console log my total and my total 2. And by the way, you can pass console log as many arguments as you want. So here I'm doing 1, 2, and it will just log as many pieces of data as you pass it. Here we see, you see both pieces of data. So what if I wanted a new total? Well, I could go up here and I could say bill is equal to 200. And now we have an error because we're trying to reassign a const. So we'll go up here and change this to a let and refresh. And now it works. But you see like all of that work that we did where we're like in between running these two pieces of code, we had to change a variable that was set before and then is yanked into this function outside. This gets confusing really quickly. And it's how you build very brittle applications. So what we want to do is instead of sort of reaching outside, we want to pass into our functions the pieces of data that we need. So let's do a little bit of cleanup here. Let's get rid of these global variables right here. We'll get rid of this line and the my total and get rid of that. Now what we want to do is these variables, bill and tax rate, we want to make them what are called params for your function. So when you define your function and you say, okay, when somebody calls it, I am going to expect somebody to pass me some data. So we put in params. I like to think of them as placeholders. So we'll say someone will pass us in a bill amount. Let's call it bill amount. And somebody will pass us in a tax rate. Then what we can do is inside of our function body, we will have access to these variables that are passed into us. It's kind of confusing because there's no like creation of these variables, but I'll explain that in just a second. Then we can go in here and we can call this a bill amount. And we call this tax rate as well. And then we return our total. Now, when we go ahead and run it, we can then pass it. The first thing it wants is the bill amount. So we'll say it was $100. And then the second thing it wants is a tax rate, 0.13. Then if I console log my total, you see that we get our value here, but I'm able to make a my total 2 really quickly. And you see that it works without having to reassign. Why? Because when you define a function, you can place what are called parameters. These are called parameters, and I always remember it because P parameter is a placeholder. And then when you run it, you pass the values. These are called arguments. I actually have a nifty little thing here. Let me open it up for you. This will be in the README of the repo for this if you want to grab it yourself. So I've got this little function definition sort of cheat sheet that I put together here. And again, this will be in the README. So right here, this is our function definition. And when we define the function name, we put in what are called parameters. Again, parameters are what are called placeholders. We'll talk about this in the future. This is called a default value. And then when you actually run your function, or you call it, or you invoke it, those are three names to actually run your function. You pass it the data that will take place of these variables. So meal will be 100, tax rate will be 0.13, and these are called arguments. So you'll hear people interchangeably use those two things, but the way to remember it is parameters are placeholders, meaning that when we define our function, they're just a placeholder because we don't know what that data will be until they're actually run. And then when you run your function, the things that you pass in are called arguments because they are actual values. So P parameter is a placeholder, or possible, some people have said as well. And A arguments are actual values. Let's keep going with this. Let's bring this back to my total. I'll just have this one. So in this case, I'm running my function, and as arguments, I'm passing straight away numbers. However, the values that get passed into a function can be in a variable as well. This is a common hang up that people have when learning how functions work, is how they sort of get renamed. So let's take a look right here. When we have a function called calculate bill, when the data gets passed in, there is going to be variables that are available inside of this function. They're going to be what's called scoped to this function, and they are only available inside of this function as to what they are passed in. So if I were to go in here and console.log, the bill amount and the tax rate, you'll see that when it runs, it tells me it's 100 and 0.13. Again, I can run that function all day long. I can even run it in here. And you see that we actually get the 200 and 0.2. Why? Because JavaScript will take whatever it is that you write as an argument, and then when you call the function, it will sort of make a temporary variable and make them available to you via the names that you put in your parameters. Now, what gets a little bit confusing to people is if somebody has a variable here and they say const like West total, and we'll say maybe my bill was $500, and const West tax rate. Maybe I have my own tax rate and it's 0.3%, 30% tax rate. Then what you can do is if you have these values in a variable, you can actually pass them into a function like this, West total, and we'll go in here and call it West tax rate. Now, the big confusion is well, if there are variables here and you pass them in here, then when it's called inside of the function, is this called bill amount or is it called West total? Well, is this even going to work? The fact that you just ran it with a variable that was not named the thing of the parameter. Well, I'll refresh it. It works just fine. See, we get 500 and 0.3. So when you run a function in JavaScript, what happens is JavaScript just takes in whatever you've passed it, and whether you've passed it that value directly as a number or a string, or whether you've passed it in via reference, meaning that you've just passed it reference to a variable, which in turn will hold a value. At the end of the day, we're still passing values, whether you pass it directly or whether you pass it reference to a variable that holds a value. JavaScript doesn't care how you're passing it in. And as soon as the function runs, it doesn't care about whether you passed in a variable or whether you passed in a value, because it just knows that you passed in a value. And then what JavaScript does is it says, okay, take whatever they passed in as the first argument, whether that's a variable value of 500 or whether I've passed it in as a straight ahead 100, and then just make a variable that's available inside the confines of these curly brackets that is called bill amount. So when this function is running, it does not care about anything else that's going outside of this function. It just knows that it's doing its job. It's been passed in the two little pieces of data that it needs. It does its little math, and then it returns its value in there. So when values get passed into a function, they sort of get renamed into whatever it is that you've defined your function parameters as. Let's do another example to sort of get that down pat, because honestly, when I'm teaching JavaScript, this is probably by far the most common thing that happens. So let's make another function here called the function say hi to, And inside of that, we will simply just return hello, and we'll pass in somebody's, we'll call it first name. And then I will const greeting is equal to say hi to, and we'll go ahead and run it. And obviously this is going to break, but let's see why. Console log that greeting. Let's get rid of this running right here. I just want to keep it as clean as possible. Here we go. Reference error. First name is not defined. Okay, good. So what happens is this function, first what it will do is it will look inside of its own function confines, its own function scope, which is these curly brackets, and it will say, do I have a variable name first name that's been passed in? And if there's not, what it will start to do is it will go up to a higher level scope and look there. Again, this is not a full explanation of scope, but we're going to go into that much more. So if there was a first name variable here, maybe we'll set that to Wes, it would actually work. Watch. Hello, Wes. Why? Because it will try to reach outside for that data if nothing is found in the scope of that function. So what we want to do is modify this, all right? What is this called? This is called a function definition. And then we'll set it to take in one parameter, which is let's call it first name. Then when we run it, we have to actually pass it a string, call it Wes, and then we will have our greeting. And what's nice about that is that we can make say hi to, and you can say Wes, you can say Kate, you can say Snickers. You get the point that right here. As long as we pass in an argument, in this case Wes, it's going to have a variable inside of the function that is referenced to whatever the person has passed in. If we actually don't run it with anything, look what happens. Hello undefined. And the reason we have that is because when a function runs, it will create the variable for us and then set it to whatever the person has passed in. But if it creates a variable and someone doesn't pass in anything, then it'll just be set to undefined, exactly how variables work. Let's keep going with a few more examples here. Let's talk about passing expressions. So we'll go back to this calculate bill here, and we'll say const my total 3 is equal to calculate bill. And obviously we can pass 100 and 0.15. We've done that a million times, and we have our my total 3 value. What happens if we do this? 20 plus 20 plus 30 plus 20. Is that going to work? And we'll take a look at my total 3, and we see 90.15. Oh, I think I goofed this up. Part of what we're going to learn about is BEDMAS, which is brackets first. And here I am screwing it up. So make sure you put the parentheses on that because it needs to add the tax rate before it multiplies. Otherwise, it does it in a weird order. But now take a look. There we go. $103.50. That works. Why? Well, because the only thing that a function can take in is a value. And whether you pass that value directly, as in a number, whether you pass that value in as a variable which holds a value, that works. And then you can also pass in expressions. And you're not actually passing in an expression. In this case, we're just running an expression. And that will first run. It will add that up to $90. And then it will pass the raw value of 90. So absolutely, totally fine to do something like that. It's actually pretty common because even if you mix and match, like const like Kate had a bill that was $100, and I'll take Kate's bill when I'm running it. We'll call it Kate, and then I'll add my own bill, which was $50, right? So it's totally fine to mix and match those types of things. It's still going to work regardless of what's going on. Let's bring that back. I'll remove this example. Pretty simple. Let's do another example here where we pass functions as arguments. So we'll make a function called doctorize here, and that will take in a name argument, and we will return just doctor, and we'll put the name there. Then in here, we're going to make another function called yell, and that takes in a name as well. And we are going to return. We're just going to say, hey, and then we're going to take the person's name and run a 2 uppercase on the end. Now we have two functions here. You might be saying like, hey, Wes, you reused a variable. Well, while it's not okay to reuse variables in the same scope multiple times, it is okay to reuse parameters. Why? Because parameters, when they're passed in, when arguments are passed in, they are only available inside of that function. So never will you run into a collision where the name that you pass in here is going to overwrite this, because these are their own little confines. They are their own little scoped functions, and the name that gets passed into doctorize is only available inside of this function, and it'll never collide with the name that is inside of here. Now, what's kind of cool about that is, well, let's just try go ahead and run it. So doctorize, we'll call it Wes. And if we try that with yell, we get hey Wes. Now, what's kind of cool is that you can pass the output of doctorize into yell. So we could say yell doctorize, and we could say Wes. Hey, Dr. Wes. So what just happened there is, let's bring that down over here. What happens here is brackets go first. So anything that is inside of here, it says, okay, well, I need to first run this function, and hopefully that returns a value, which it does. It returns hello it returns doctor in the name. And then the value that's returned from doctorize immediately gets passed into yell as an argument. And then that will in turn return, hey, Dr. Wes. So again, just another way that we can pass a value to a function is the output of a function is just a value at the end of the day, and you can actually run that directly. Now let's talk about default values. I'm going to comment out this yell right here, or just remove it entirely. And let's go up to this tax rate right here. You may be thinking like, that's a little bit silly to have to pass it in directly every single time, or even if we go to this yell function that we have here. If I run yell and it says Wes, obviously it works. But if I run just yell directly without passing it an argument, it just says uncaught type error, cannot read property to uppercase of undefined. And what's happening is that this to uppercase function, it's technically a method. We'll go into that in a bit. It's trying to run it against something that didn't get passed in. And that's just first of all, you shouldn't have forgot it. But if someone forgets to pass a value to the yell function, our whole program's going to break. So what we can do is we can actually set what's called defaults. When you define your function inside of your function definition, you can set a default by saying name is equal to, and we'll call them silly goose. And now what will happen is if I run this again with yell passing Wes, it will still work. But if you pass it without passing any value to it, it will fall back to whatever the default value was in your function definition. So that's great. So as you define your function, you can say, if somebody does not pass this parameter here called name, just default it to silly goose. So we can go up here to our tax rate, and we can always just set a default to 0.13. And what that will allow us to do is we can simply just call our calculate bill with $100, and it'll say, okay, well, they didn't pass a tax rate, so we're just going to default to 0.13, and we get our actual value that's returned here. So I often like to do that, even if you go as far as to just say name is equal to an empty string. What that will do is it will just make sure that it falls back to an empty string, and it won't error out. It just won't show you anything in that case. So you'll see me doing that sometimes when we hit a lot of our exercises. I'll just set the default to be a value of nothing of that type. And that's just to sort of safeguard myself from any cases where I'm not passing it in or forget or something like that. Let's take it one step further now, and let's modify this calculate bill to also take a tip rate. So let's go in here, let's take a bill amount, a tax rate, and then we also have a tip rate argument. Let's default the tip to 0.15%, 15%. By the way, the Europeans that are listening, where tip is not required and tax is built into the price, congratulations, you're lucky. Not so easy here in Canada and in the US. So let's get rid of this console log here. And now what we do is we say the total is equal to the bill amount plus, and we'll take this and we'll say the bill amount times the tax rate plus, and we'll say it's the bill amount times the tip rate. Now you see my prettier right there. I just put in those parentheses because I was thinking that these had to run first. And then I gave it a save, and Prettier automatically fixed it because those were unnecessary parentheses that were put in there. The bedmass rules do not need to happen there. So when I save it, it just removes them. That's why I like Prettier. I can just put them in when I'm thinking about it, and it says, "Oh, Wes, you're dumb. You don't know what you're doing." It will remove them for us. So now if I run calculate bill and pass it $100, we get $128 because I have a 13% tax rate and a 15% tip rate, and they have defaulted. Now, one little sort of gotcha that happens here is, what if you want to use the default tax rate but not the default tip rate? So we'll go here. Let's go to the very bottom. Const my bill for is equal to calculate bill $100, and you want to use the default tax rate. So just maybe skip it or something like that. Like, I don't know what goes in here. And then I want to pass a 20% tip rate. This is going to break, right? Watch. My bill for unexpected token, comma. Okay, it expected you to actually pass a value here. So the only thing that you can pass into a function to make it kick back to its default value is undefined, meaning that functions will only ever fall back to their defaults if nothing is passed. And remember, when a variable is not set to anything, it is the value of undefined. So you can't go ahead and pass 0 here and expect it to fall back to the default, or you can't say false or anything like that. You have to pass undefined, and what that will do is it will we're explicitly passing undefined, and then that will make it fall back to 0.13, and it works just like we had wanted. It's very often, it's very infrequently that I actually ever have to do that, but it's worth knowing that that's how the function will define whether it should fall back to the default or not. And it's nothing to do with truthy or falsy, which we're going to learn in an upcoming video. So that's parameters and arguments. In the next video, we're going to look at a handful of other ways to define a function rather than just the function keyword and followed by the name of the function.